So, according to Karl Marx, it's all about money. Whatever people do, they do it for money. And all human events on both the individual scale and on the collective scale or scales are to be explained in terms of the pursuit of wealth. And I made a podcast about how this is about why this is totally false. And something just occurred to me. So mafiosos, the Italian American mafia, they actually did not make very much money. Okay, sometimes they did, some of them did, some of them sometimes made a lot of money. But for the most part, it averaged out to around 20,000 a year. That's the actual number. Of course, they didn't pay taxes on that, but okay, so fine. So, given that they don't pay taxes, that equates to around $30,000 a year. So why'd they do it? I'll tell you why they did it, because they wanted to be free. They wanted to be autonomous. That's primarily what it was about. When people... Okay, so the reason they did what they did is that they didn't want to be yoked in by the standard social contract. They did have a social contract, but it was with a different group of people. It was with a very different kind of group of people, and the terms of that social contract were different. And according to the terms of those contracts, they could, in fact, they were required to hold on to a certain amount of autonomy. Okay, so that's a very important fact. Now, why is it that people start their own businesses? Why is it that I, basically... I could have made an absolute fortune had I worked for a corporation. I could still be making quite a lot, almost six figures, had I elected to keep my job, which I could have done at this small Ivy League college. But I chose to be an entrepreneur, which has, thus far not exactly been vindicated from a strictly financial standpoint. But why did I choose to do it? Was it in order to make more money? Not really. And why do people become entrepreneurs? I mean, the guy who opens a pizza parlor, which is very hard to do, and which is in the sense that it requires a lot of work, and also in the sense that it requires a fair amount of intelligence, believe it or not. He does that because he wants to be independent. Okay, why did I become an entrepreneur? Because I want to be independent. Okay, now it is true that if you're an entrepreneur, the sky is the limit in terms of how much you can make, but that's not why you do it. I mean, if your objective is to maximize the probability that you will make a reasonably large amount of money, at least, your best bet, by far, hands down, utterly, is simply to keep your nose to the grindstone, go to business school or something, and work for an investment bank. Okay, you don't have to be a genius to do that. You do have to be reasonably smart. Okay, I mean, there are no morons working at First Boston, I would think. No, there are not. There are no morons. Okay, but you don't have to be a luminary. You have to be reasonably smart. Okay. Reasonably. But I mean, if you do that, I mean, I know people who are pretty stunted, actually, who are making an absolute ton of money. Okay. Now, and also, if you're a kind of, I mean, let's say you're the absolute greatest nonfiction writer in the world. I mean, you'll be lucky if you're making $20,000 a year. Unless you happen to have some kind of a plum job, like you're at a university, which is sort of a bullshit job, or at a newspaper, which is a different kind of bullshit job. It's a slightly less spurious than a professorship, but in that case, you're not really making money from your work. I mean, if you're really, I mean, so the monetarily most successful freelance writer makes 1/5 what a very mediocre lawyer makes. So why do they do it? Well, it's not about the money, right? I mean, you have to really warp the data. What people want, I mean, they want the things that money buys. Now, money buys a lot of things. Money is a very good thing. Okay, now one of the things that it is supposed to buy, and that it does buy up to a point, is a certain measure of freedom. Okay, now some people choose to bypass the toil and slavery, the lack of freedom that is involved in making the money with which you can purchase that freedom, because they want the freedom sooner or later. They want the freedom while they still have their youth. I mean, they want the freedom during their creative years, right? I mean, that's what I chose to do. I mean, I lived on a very small amount of money, but I wrote, a veritable library of books, and I overfulfilled my childhood objectives of being a writer 10 times over by the time I was around 35. Okay, now I paid for it heavily in the sense that I was living on a very small amount of money. But again, I was developing my mind. I mean, I lived exactly the way I wanted to live. I mean, I would have liked to have had a little more comfort and things like that. And, women were not exactly thrilled with my studio apartment. Okay. But that's a different thing. But in the relevant sense, I lived the way I wanted to live. And I woke up and I it was great. And I would either work on my books or I would read somebody else's books, and these were good books, writing and reading. And so, it was about freedom. Now, these mafiosos are real predators, and they are very, very, very money oriented. But even they, right? Even they, for them, it was not exactly about money. And for the entrepreneur, it's not exactly about money. And again, and the entrepreneurs who, or the mafiosos for that matter, but the entrepreneurs certainly who make huge amounts of money, even for them, it's not exactly about money, because so much is involved in making really, really, really large amounts of money that it cannot, that there has to be something else that they're doing that in the process of making that money that is an end unto itself. They have to sort of enjoy the craft of doing it, simply because there's so many bridges to cross that unless they were in the process of making that money doing something that was an end unto itself, they simply couldn't cross all those bridges. They simply run out of gas well before they made, the first 100,000, let alone the first billion. So, no, this whole idea that it's all about money, that on the individual level can be explained in terms of the pursuit of wealth, that idea is totally misconceived. Now, does it follow that that on the collective level, it's not all about the pursuit of wealth? Well, people will say, "Oh, well, that's the aggregative fallacy or the fallacy of composition." Actually, no, I don't. First of all, no. I mean, as I discussed elsewhere, I mean, when you look at social institutions and you look at collective behavior, it's very hard to explain in terms of the desire for money. And also, I don't think, for what it's worth, that in this particular context, that I don't think that in this particular context, one is committing the fallacy of composition in saying that, given that the individual is not always pursuing money, it follows that the collective is not always pursuing money. In any case, a lot of people who are supposedly, here's a new thing. When people are supposedly pursuing money, what they're really pursuing is something else. And I think that other thing is autonomy. Actually, that's really what they're pursuing. And, now wealth, so are they right to be pursuing it in that way? I mean, how is wealth some kind of a poor substitute for autonomy? That's a different question, but I don't think there's really any delineation of pretty much anything Marx said whereby it comes out correct. And actually, here is one other point. I was kind of fishing around for this point, which is that Marx himself did not try to make money at all. I mean, he I've spoken ill of him, and I actually have kind of complex feelings towards him and towards his work. But what did he do? Well, he lived like a philosopher, okay, which is what he was. I mean, he lived the way I used to live, and which is still kind of the way I'm living, although I'm changing that. But what did he do? He wrote his books. He read a lot. He was not pursuing money. Okay, he was not, and so he had to rely on Engels and on other people for money. And so he himself was a counterexample to his own contention that it's all about money, that people are driven by the desire for money. And the thing is that what that suggests is that his thesis, his supposedly dispassionately made claim that people are driven by the desire for money, was actually made very petulantly. He was bitter because he'd been snubbed by the Academy or some such. And, he decided, oh, well, those people who didn't give me tenure, or who didn't give me this or that, they're just driven by money, they're sellouts, which, may well be true, which probably was true approximately. But his thesis that it's all about money is it's not really the thesis of an economist. It's the thesis of a kind of radio show host, of a kind of bitter radio show host. And it's made petulantly. And like actually virtually everything that Marx says, it's this supposedly hard-headed kind of bitterly realistic thesis that is not bitterly realistic. It's actually superficially realistic. It's genuinely bitter, but superficially realistic, and actually just kind of petulant and it's sort of a sour grapes response, So he couldn't get what he wanted, so everybody else is driven by money. In any case, the relevant point is that he himself did live like a philosopher, not somebody who was chasing the bucks.